Welcome, everybody. My name is Liz Carver. I'm the Communications Manager at Groundwork USA, and I want to thank you all for joining Groundwork USA today for our webinar on starting a Groundwork Trust in your community. Today, I'm going to be joined by Groundwork USA's Director of Operations, Stacy Moran. And you'll be hearing from Stacy in just a minute, but before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes for you. The first is that today's webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it for future reference. In the next couple days, we'll email you the link to the recorded webinar along with a PDF of today's presentation. And these will also be available on Groundwork USA's website. I'm going to go ahead and mute all the lines to avoid background noise during Stacy's presentation. So let me go ahead and do that.
The conference has been muted.
Okay, thank you. So as I was saying, I've gone ahead and muted all the lines so there won't be any background noise during the presentation. So please save your questions for the Q&A that will follow Stacy's presentation. And there'll be a couple ways you can submit questions. The first is through the chat feature through our webinar platform, ReadyTalk. You should see a chat icon in the lower left-hand corner of your screen or bottom center if you're joining on a mobile device. And if you have questions or comments during Stacy's presentation, please type them in the chat area and we'll address them at the end of the webinar. You can also raise your hand by clicking the Raise Hand button or icon at the bottom of your screen, and during the Q&A, we'll unmute your line so you can ask your question or comment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stacy Moran, Groundwork USA's Operations Director.
The country.
There you go. Stacy, why don't you start again? Sorry.
Yeah,
I think you may have been muted.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. So hi again to anyone that didn't hear me. Thanks again for joining us today to talk about starting a Groundwork Trust in your community. It's wonderful to connect with lots of you from around the country today. Each year we open our call for letters of interest, a call for letters for communities interested in exploring the idea of starting a trust. And today we'll do a brief overview of the Groundwork model and the network of trusts across the country, and then move into discussing the process of establishing a Groundwork Trust. As my colleague Liz noted, we'll upload the recording of this webinar to the website and email it out. And you can always reach out to me following this presentation with any questions, and my contact information will be at the end here. So let's get started. So the Groundwork Network is the only network of locally based organizations devoted to ensuring that all people have access to healthy, resilient neighborhoods and the access to opportunities that go along with that. Local Groundwork organizations work exclusively in low and moderate income neighborhoods, and we differ a bit in the structure that we have set up. There are national organizations that open offices in various locations across the country, and then there are locally based organizations existing in communities kind of on their own, figuring things out. But we're unique at Groundwork in that we are a network of those locally based organizations. And the benefit is that in being a small network linked together in mission, there's a high degree of intimacy because we are so small, which encourages and supports peer learning. And at the same time, Groundwork organizations are locally based, which allows for really true local action responding to identified local needs. And as I talk about the work of our network throughout this presentation, you'll see that our mission is not just to create great places and improve opportunity, but to do so and do it in a way with a deep and meaningful collaboration with the community. So our network currently includes 20 local trusts across the country, with another in the works in Kansas City, Kansas, that will soon be on this map. The local offices are linked to a national organization, that's Groundwork USA, and together the trusts and Groundwork USA make up the Groundwork Network. Groundwork USA staff are based primarily in offices of local Groundwork trusts. A couple of Groundwork USA staff have previously worked in local trusts, and generally our staff is well versed in the work happening at the local level as a result of meaningful support offered in connection to all the trusts that are currently in existence. And of course, through our backgrounds of previously working directly with communities. I know that's quick to look at this slide. It's also available on our website as well. So while the programs and projects of the network are diverse, all of these are based on a common underlying set of values. First and foremost is equity and access to opportunity and well-being, a commitment to addressing economic inequity and a legacy of racial injustice. Of course, there's the common focus on green, healthy, and resilient neighborhoods. We are about leading by doing. The Groundwork community is very much a community of doers. It's not about finding someone to do the work, but rather rolling up the sleeves, diving in and doing it, and bringing more people into the work and folding in the community, and really making sure that that work is community-driven. Our work is guided by the idea that we need to invest in places and people to see real change in the development of opportunity. As our tagline goes, changing places, changing lives, it is something that is real and happening in trust communities across the country every day. And finally, but most importantly, as I keep mentioning, we are committed to and wholeheartedly believe that everyone in the community has a role to play in lifting up their community and neighborhoods. Meaningful engagement and collaboration really is at the heart of our work. So Groundwork USA provides a national model which is informed by best practices and research. And while this model exists and allows for commonality in the approach we share in some of our core programming that I'll mention in just a moment, the framework provides and allows for local innovation in pursuit of local priorities. There are some common program threads across the network, but every trust is really doing something that no one else in the network is doing. They all kind of have their unique kind of flagship programming. So on this slide here, you see the science barge of Groundwork Hudson Valley based out of Yonkers, New York on the Hudson River. The barge is a hydroponics farm and educational space powered by renewable energy. Lots of really great, amazing things in that sentence there. This program is unique to Groundwork Hudson Valley. It's the only trust that's operating programming in this manner. We do have some that are doing different farms, but this is on a barge in the Hudson Valley River. And it's just one example of the innovative programming and projects that is happening across the network every day. So as is clear with our focus areas you see here, our work is really at the intersect of environment, economy, and civic engagement. Across the network, our trusts focus their work to varying degrees on equitable development and redevelopment, healthy communities, which spans a wide range of things, including urban and community farming, building walking and biking infrastructure, tree planting, and the like. A big part of our work is transforming once vacant and or contaminated brownfield lands into community assets, such as greenways, parks, and similar spaces. Improving the health of and access to our urban waterways in the communities, and providing meaningful opportunities for youth to explore career pathways to really build the next generation of environmental leaders. This includes hands-on training experiences, both at the local level in their trust community, but also our national trips, where a handful of trusts come together at once in some select national parks to receive training that they can then take back to their communities. So I just want to take an extra moment to touch on something that is becoming more and more relevant every day in doing this type of work, and the challenge that exists by really the growing inequity in the United States, that too many people across the country are being left behind when communities prosper. The benefits of that prosperity are not equal. Equitable development and redevelopment is an overarching goal of our network that we are committed to. As such, a couple years ago, the network came together and came up with the following principles on equitable development you see here. And those are that everyone in the community should benefit from development or redevelopment. that in urban communities that are seeing a resurgence of population and revitalization, those original residents of those communities who have been there through all of the tough times and the good times should not be displaced and should share in today's and tomorrow's prosperity. The community should be involved in defining what is a benefit to the community and what they want to see happen and change. We believe that asset-based planning, focusing on strengths and existing resources in communities, even those that are stressed communities, is a really important way to go about the work. There's a culture of mutual accountability, and we must build bridges, build big tents, and bring people together who maybe have not worked together in the past. And we mean this everyday citizens, right, but also public and private partnerships. It's all about collaboration to find that common ground. And most importantly, perhaps, is that there's no finish line. There is no time when the job is done. The oldest groundwork trusts have made some enormous differences in their communities, but none of them would say that the work is ever done. So what is meant by the term trust? You probably heard me mention it here a few dozen times. In the United States, Groundwork Trusts are independent 501c3 nonprofit entities established by the local stakeholders in the community. So they are part of the network, but they operate quite autonomously. As I've kind of mentioned, they have their own unique programming, but we're all kind of bound by this core focus, mission, and common themes. The term trust comes from our origins in the Groundwork United Kingdom model, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. In the United Kingdom, nonprofit charities are referred to as trusts. As the model was adopted here in the United States, and Groundwork Trusts became really the intermediaries between the local government and neighborhood residents, we find the term is actually quite fitting, as the term trust really speaks to the more commonly understood definition of that word, that being a relationship developed across various people in the communities of these groundwork organizations that's rooted in honesty and really believing in the reliability of others. Groundwork USA and each trust share the name and mission and a common approach, but how our work is implemented on the ground depends on local conditions and the needs of the community. And really the purpose of requiring the adoption of the Groundwork name, logo, and mission is twofold. One, to build that brand recognition nationally in order to see the benefits of that recognition locally, and two, to use a model that is well established and informed by best practices. So the history of Groundwork USA is important to know to better understand how we are set up as a network and how the Groundwork model really came to be, as I just started to say a moment ago. So Groundwork USA was adapted from the model of Groundwork United Kingdom, a successful environmental justice movement that began in the 1980s, during a recession in the United Kingdom when the environmental and social conditions were in quite distress. There was a realization that there needed to be a new, more creative response to the situation, and this is where the Groundwork UK model was developed. And since the 1980s, Groundwork UK has renewed hundreds of economically distressed areas of the United Kingdom. So where did Groundwork USA begin? Groundwork USA began in the 1990s, when we really saw the environmental justice and brownfield revitalization movement get underway here nationally in the United States. A team led by the National Park Service and the Environmental Protection Agency was seeking a model to engage local communities in improving their neighborhoods that have been affected by disinvestment and brownfields. They found that model that they were seeking operating in the United Kingdom with Groundwork and decided to bring that back to the United States. The Groundwork USA initiative was launched in 1996, so it came officially over from the UK to the USA in 1996 by the National Park Service Rivers Trails Conservation Assistance Program and the Groundwork USA Steering Committee, both parties really seeking a long-term strategy for engaging in urban communities and improving public access to open space. The National Park Service was later joined by the EPA in 1997, which ultimately provided seed funding to establish trusts in 3 pilot communities, which were Bridgeport, Connecticut, Lawrence, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island, 3 trusts that are still standing today. And to this day, we still share the name, logo, and tagline with the Groundwork UK network. The Environmental Protection Agency and the National Park Service partnership continues to this day and has expanded over the past 20 years or so. It provides the two agencies a way to service communities and advance their work in a very distinct way, and that really is being able to focus work on the ground, right in communities around the country in a way that allows for tangible outcomes and engages deeply the community members directly in those projects and programs. Our relationship, both with the EPA and the National Park Service, provides real value to the local organizations on the ground. And this relationship has continued to deepen over time and extend beyond those original offices we worked with within each agency. For example, we now work with the Office of Water and Office of Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency. And in addition to working with many National Park Service units beyond Rivers Trails Conservation Assistance Program, we work with and within national park system around the country. So you might be asking why an interagency agreement between EPA, the National Park Service, to support Groundwork. And really, as I was mentioning earlier, Groundwork makes the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Park Service more relevant to residents' everyday lives. And by working together, the three parties are fulfilling the mission of all three of ours: Groundwork, Environmental Protection Agency, and National Park Service. So with that background on the Groundwork model and network, let's turn to the process for developing a Groundwork trust, the primary reason you all are here today. So there are basically 6 steps, and some of these are actually phases, which I'll walk through a bit. It begins with the formation locally of a steering committee, submission of a letter of interest to USA, followed by a site visit to communities that are selected, and submission of a full proposal from communities who are invited to submit one. And then from there, a full feasibility study, which is really a planning process, and a vote locally to commit to launching the new organization. And then finally, entering into that launch or startup phase of the new Groundwork organization. So the steering committee, what goes on at this point, and what does our kind of review committee here look for in a local steering committee? Above all, the steering committee needs to be representative of the community and be inclusive, that is reflective of the socioeconomic, gender, and racial diversity of the community, and include people from various sectors of the community. That includes residents, local businesses, local government, and the like. Those who come together really need to be prepared to commit to supporting this process locally on the ground through all of the phases we're kind of walking through, with most of the heavy lift from the steering committee coming during the feasibility study phase. And they must agree to a ground rules established as a group. Additionally, the local committee must have a skilled, really committed chairperson to help structure and lead the process, and act as a liaison between all those steering committee members locally and Groundwork USA and the National Park Service. Groundwork USA doesn't dictate the particular ways of operating at this stage, but we do look for a shared commitment to pursuing near and long-term changes in the community, and a sincere interest in really pulling together for the long haul. Because this is as you see here, this is about a 6-month process, and obviously from there, should the trust launch, we are excited by and expect to see a trust in it for the long haul. The initial work of the steering committee culminates in a letter of interest, which describes how the steering committee ideas would come to fruition and how Groundwork can take root in the community. The letter of interest is a 4- to 5-page letter. The requirements are set out in detail in the RFP that you can find on the Groundwork USA website. We ask for an overview of the demographics of the community, the environmental, economic, and community development challenges that exist, a demonstration of interest in taking on these challenges, potential and tangible opportunities a new trust can pursue in both the near and long term. We look for a lead organization and contact person who can really coordinate with us at Groundwork and the National Park Service during the early stages. And we look for an ability to leverage local funding support, whether that's municipal, private, in-kind, corporate, or foundation. And lastly, we look for an account of what has gone on with past funding or technical assistance from our federal partners, the Environmental Protection Agency, particularly the Brownfield Program, from the National Park Service, Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, and or any technical assistance or work with Groundwork USA in the past. Groundwork USA does lead a technical assistance program in equitable development for communities with brownfields. And then what is the potential for Groundwork to create, improve, engage the community in stewardship of parks, greenways, gardens, urban farms, and the like? What is the potential to stimulate local economic revitalization that benefits all community members, in particular those who have faced challenges or people who have been left out of prosperity in the past? How will Groundwork build local capacity to take on those 3 E's, the environment, economy, and equity? And how will the local organization engage local stakeholders in planning and carrying out projects, programs, and partnerships that are in that vision? The third step, following review by the selection committee of those letters of interest, Groundwork and National Park Service will schedule site visits with a subset of communities who have submitted a letter of interest. Basically, what we're looking for is the reality behind the letter of interest. Who are the people behind this interest? What is the passion driving them? What is the vision? Why Groundwork? Why now? Why here? And what is the nature of the need? And is there energy in a set of working relationships existing and or in the making that can really make transformative change happen in that community? After the site visit, we invite a small number of communities to submit full proposals, which essentially expands and more fully develops the ideas and visions in the letter of interest, discusses the roles of key partners, and gets more specific and detailed on some of the local initiatives or initial initiatives the Groundwork Trust could take on. We look for big visions that can be pursued over time that a local trust could champion, something transformative in the community. At this stage, we also require a firm financial commitment of support and overall backing from the highest ranking city official, whether that be a city manager or mayor. To proceed to the next step, it is required that that local government entity commits to and provides a local funding commitment of $35,000 a year for 3 years, and also that a private sector commitment is made of at least $10,000 a year for 3 years. These commitments support and supplement the financial support provided through Groundwork USA from our federal partner agencies. After the committee has reviewed the full proposals, we will select one community to proceed with a full planning study, which is that feasibility study you heard me mention. It's typically a 6-month process, so it could be a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on the community. Generally, we like to keep it around 6 months to keep momentum going and interest going. It's not too quick to skip over anything and kind of hit that sweet spot of keeping folks interested. The study is supported by National Park Service and Groundwork USA staff who will work with the local steering committee. Groundwork USA and National Park Service staff will typically go and visit the community 4 to 6 times during the course of the study, and we also provide up to $7,000 to engage a local project coordinator to staff the local steering committee and help keep moving things along at the local level. Groundwork USA staff in the local coordinator that is hired to support the community then support the drafting of the feasibility study, which is essentially a blueprint for the new organization. It goes into detail on the needs of the community, opportunities for the new trust, priorities, gets really specific on some projects, programs, and partnerships, and again, starts to lay that blueprint. During the course of the feasibility study, there'll be a lot of meet and greets with local stakeholders or funders to get various partnerships going, and all of that is supported again with Groundwork USA staff and National Park Service staff. Additionally, lots of thought goes into how a new trust would fit within the landscape of existing organizations already doing work in the community. Investment in a new community is really based on a gap that exists. If there's a sense that everything that needs to be done can be done with the existing entities in a community, it's probably not the best fit or the right place for a groundwork trust. There really needs to be a strong perceived need for an organization to take a holistic look at the needs of the community and for the solutions to those needs to be driven by the community. At the end of the feasibility study process, there's a yay or nay vote on whether the local steering committee would like to proceed with the establishment of a groundwork trust. And then the creation of a new trust needs to be approved by Groundwork USA Board of Directors with concurrence from those federal partners, the National Park Service and the Environmental Protection Agency. Finally, this brings us to the final phase, the launch phase, which is really the startup phase for the new Groundwork organization. It typically starts with a launch event that kicks off the new organization for a broader audience in the community beyond, those who were intimately involved in the process up until this point. The Groundwork Trust then signs, the new Groundwork Trust then signs a memorandum of understanding with Groundwork USA and commits to organizational development milestones over about a 3-year period. The framework for this phase, the launch phase, is described here on this slide. As seed funding is provided by the National Park Service and Environmental Protection Agency through Groundwork USA in the amount of $190,000, which is dispersed over 3 to 4 years. Approximately half of that is dispersed in the first year to really get things started. The balance of that, subject of course to federal budgeting processes, is released over 3 years in annual increments of $25,000 to $50,000. I should note that we don't begin this entire process without knowing that through this phase, these federal commitments will be followed through on. This tapered delivery of those funds reflects the expectation that seed funds will be leveraged by the newly established Groundwork Trust, which is assumed to will begin its fundraising efforts to local, state, federal, and philanthropic grant funds and donations to really expand its project and program slate, and of course to increase staffing capacity and keep the organization moving along from the beginning. The vehicle for this federal funding is called a task agreement, which is between the National Park Service and Groundwork USA. Task agreements detail the deliverables, organizational building activities, and expected outcomes of those activities. The funding is then flowed through National Park Service to USA and then on to that local organization. There's a fiduciary fiscal sponsorship agreement between Groundwork USA and the new trust. As some of you may be aware on the call, the IRS needs to provide a nonprofit status for a 501c3, which does take some time. So during that gap or that time period, Groundwork USA acts as the fiscal sponsor of the new Groundwork entity. So during this phase, there's a lot of support and interaction between Groundwork USA staff and the new organization and our federal partners. We are as hands-on as will be helpful, but note that the local organization is an autonomous entity, but part of our network, and really is in control of its vision and its future. So that brings me kind of what are the next steps in this process today? Hopefully many of you are considering submitting a letter of interest, which is due by July 31st of this year. That is a firm date. We expect notification of selection for site visits. We'll go about 2 weeks following that, and then expect to conduct those site visits around August, September. Following those visits, we expect to be releasing a full proposal, requesting a full proposal from a subset of those communities which we visit, anticipating that's due October 15th of this year. Upon review of those proposals, we'll notify the community selected to begin a feasibility study, and that feasibility study itself is expected to begin around December. Just pause on this for a second. I know there's a bunch of dates on there. And again, all of this information is in our RFP, which is available on our website. So this really is a unique opportunity for people to come together and participate in improving their community. Creating and growing a Groundwork organization really does mean rolling up the sleeves and getting to work to improve the community in a way that is very unique, open to everyone, and is fun and very personally rewarding. The creation of a Groundwork organization really does mean building new relationships and having a chance for people who may have never worked together or collaborated in the past to carry out really solid ideas and visions for their communities, and to see change happen that is driven by the community. So with that, I have my contact information here, and also my colleague Heather Pashier from the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program at the National Park Service. Like I said at the beginning, you are welcome to reach out directly with questions. But I will close in saying that we are really looking forward to working with and hearing from you all, and I will hand it back to Liz now for some questions.
Great. Thank you, Stacy. I see that there are actually many questions that have been submitted through the chat box, so we'll start today's Q&A with those questions. Sorry. And if you have any additional questions or comments that come up as we move through the Q&A, please feel free to type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, or click the raise hand button or icon to let us know you want us to unmute your line. One thing, if you're connected to the webinar audio over a phone and not over computer, we can't actually tell which number is yours to unmute. So if you want to ask a question and you're connected by phone, please type your phone number into the chat box and then we can unmute you. So I'm going to just take some questions in the order that they came. We have a question. Can a 501c3 create and implement a Groundwork USA project within the boundary of a national park unit? What if and National Park Service isn't the landowner, or is the landowner?
There's a lot wrapped up in that question. I'm not sure if that person means they are a existing 501c3 that wants to become a trust, which I can answer that question in saying that we have had a handful, or a couple I should say, existing organizations transform and go through this process of becoming a Groundwork Trust, which is still the same process. Your particular question about Liz, maybe I might seem repeating here depending on my response. Your particular point about doing a project on National Park Service land, we do as a network projects and programming on National Park Service land that is in collaboration very deeply with the local park itself, depending on what park it is. I may need to follow up with you directly about that question.
Okay, great. Another question that's come through, can the ratio of public and private funding commitments be adjusted? For example, 10,000 public funding and 35,000 private.
That's a good question. We have the formula set very specifically with the intention that a lot of the work, or I should say all of the work we do in the Groundwork communities happens in very close collaboration with the local government. So that is the intention of requiring the $35,000 commitment from the local government, because we really need them to be invested partners in this process. So we do keep that ratio, and we're not very flexible on it.
Okay. Point of clarification, Stacy. Someone was wondering, did you mention during discussion of the feasibility study that it would not be a good idea if the initiative was undertaken by an existing organization?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I think I actually can clarify that. I think I know exactly the sentence. I know what I was saying. No, absolutely. As I was just saying previously, we have had a couple of organizations that were existing nonprofits that transformed and became into a Groundwork Trust. What I was saying there is really we like to make sure that when we are moving through this process to establish a Groundwork Trust, that we're looking at the landscape of the community and seeing what existing organizations are already there to make sure that we're not duplicating services, programs, projects, etc. That if there's no gap or need for a Groundwork Trust in a community, because another organization is fulfilling that need, that we're aware of that, and we are keeping that in mind as we go through this establishment process.
Great. Thank you. Stacey, a question about branding, actually, and the Groundwork name. Does a new trust need to be called, quote-unquote, a Groundwork Trust, or could it be local nonprofit name, comma, a Groundwork Trust initiative? And the person asking has a current program that already has a name and profile established in the community, and would hope that could remain prominent.
Yeah, I can understand that concern. We do require the adoption of the Groundwork name. So, for example, Groundwork Lawrence, Groundwork Providence, Groundwork Denver. And as I mentioned, that purpose is one, for brand recognition nationally, and the benefits of that definitely trickle down locally. And because that is the structure and the model that we have, and we are kind of cohesive in that, so it is required that there is the adoption of the name, logo, and mission. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Those points, okay.
If anybody has a follow-up question, by the way, please feel free to type it into the chat box if Stacey hasn't answered your question fully or you have a follow-up. So we've got a couple questions, actually a few questions about future funding technical assistance opportunities. Some folks may not be ready to pursue this immediately, but might be interested a year or two down the road. So what do we anticipate in the next year or two? Mm-hmm. And do we anticipate putting out a next RFP or call for letters of interest?
That's a great question. We do, yes. We typically, pending federal funding commitments, will open this process up annually. It is traditional that it's closer to the beginning of the year. This year, because of federal government shutdown, it was delayed a bit. But yes, we do anticipate it annually. And to your question of kind of needing to gather folks and do all the hard work to get this process started, one, it's completely understandable, and two, I'll say that it's quite common that we see some communities who are interested in joining us, as you have today for this webinar, who will kind of absorb all the information and start to lay the work following that, and really don't apply until the next year. So yes, we do anticipate opening it back up annually, which is how it has been for the past few years. And two, very common for folks to kind of immerse themselves in the information and apply the following year.
Great. Thank you, Stacey. I see we have a few questions about the nature of the match contribution, and I'll give them to you one at a time. The first question is, can the public contribution be in the form of staff time, or does it have to be financial?
It has to be financial.
Okay. Let's see. And how is private support defined? Does it include philanthropic dollars, or does it just mean corporate in this sense?
Both. So it can be corporate, or it can be your typical foundation grants or commitment.
And yes, a couple follow-ups. Could that funding from local government be allocated with a specific programmatic purpose, such as moving a relevant program out from City Hall to the newly created Groundwork Trust, or would the letter of commitment need to be completely flexible and unassigned?
That money is typically reserved for capacity building purposes, since it is at the very beginning of a development of trust that first installment is required. I may have to follow up with you on that one in terms of specifically how, if the money could be allocated towards for your example here, a project or a program specifically, as opposed to just allocated to the whole organization. Let me follow up with you about that one.
Okay. You may have answered this one, but the contribution needs to be financial. Is that correct? Not dedicated staff time. Okay. So it absolutely does need to be a financial match.
To answer that a little bit, to build out that answer a little bit, the purpose of that is that, as I had mentioned, there is this kind of seed funding and capacity building funding, both to launch and then 3 to 4 years following the establishment of a trust. And that local commitment from the federal government is to help support that launch. It takes a lot to get a Groundwork Trust and any nonprofit started. So that commitment is not only important to show the local government's commitment to the Groundwork Trust locally, but also to really help establish and get the trust moving.
Great. And another funding question, can the public contribution be made by a coalition of several local governments?
Yes, it sounds like maybe it's a, missing my word I'm looking for here, but a unified government almost. I would say yes. I can follow up with you about that to get more clarification potentially on your question, but that shouldn't be an issue.
Okay, a couple of other questions have come in. Folks would like to clarify. Let's see here. Sorry, just lost that question. They want to make sure how many communities will be chosen through the selection process. They're wondering how competitive it is and whether we would just choose one community per year.
I don't think I caught the beginning of that. If it's how competitive is the process and if only one per community is selected per year?
Correct.
So it is a competitive process. It truly varies year to year how many we receive. This is, I would say in my time here, the most folks we've ever seen registered for this webinar. We do only select one community, and that selection whittles down to one community at the feasibility study phase 1 for capacity to make sure that when we're establishing and standing up a groundwork organization that we're doing so with the amount of support that is needed. It would be really difficult to do more than one at a time. And just for funding purposes as well, it's just kind of been the way we've gone about just establishing one per year for capacity reasons and to grow our network meaningfully.
We have a question about the letter of interest, and just if you could talk a little bit more about the structure and content of the letter of interest.
I can. I'm navigating back to those slides just so you can look at it too as I am. So these, as you see here, are all the details about the letter of interest. It goes into quite detail in the request for proposals that's listed on our website. I'm not sure if you have specific questions about it, but generally, again, looking for, it's about a 4 to 5 page letter. Trying to get our head around the demographics in the community, challenges that the community is facing as it relates to kind of our focus areas. As it says here, are the environmental, economic, and community development challenges. We want to feel and hear about the demonstrated interest in your community. And something else I was saying during the presentation too is really this is the time where you've started to form your steering committee just before this and are pulling together the letter of interest from that group, making sure that that group is reflective of your community and speaks to the needs that are identified within and by your community. And then as it says here, what potential opportunities are, identifying that lead organization or contact person for Groundwork USA to be in touch with and the National Park Service, and talking a bit about the ability to leverage local funding, as I've mentioned here in these kind of follow-up questions of the importance of that to really launching and establishing a Groundwork Trust. But happy to follow up directly if you have any more specific questions, but I would definitely point you to the RFP, which goes into great detail about that.
Great, thanks, Stacy. Question that's I think has come up before: can a Groundwork chapter encompass more than one city?
So that's a great question. It can. It depends, right? Because we're not going to want probably a Groundwork Trust to be working in cities that are geographically very distant. But we absolutely have trusts that are working, I want to use the word regionally. So good examples of that are Groundwork Rhode Island, which initially started in Providence, Rhode Island, and has expanded increasingly their work into Central Falls, Rhode Island, and Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And that's an example of a small one, so I could see how some of my folks might think, well, it's a small state, it could be less of a population to be working with. But it's also true for other communities that they'll start in one city and start to expand a little bit. Groundwork Elizabeth, New Jersey is another great example of that. They kind of almost work countywide in Union County, but we do typically encourage for a smaller kind of geographic scope or focus area. It really depends on the size of those communities and kind of the needs in those communities. We don't want anyone stretching themselves too thin. But certainly we want to make sure that there is enough work to be done for a Groundwork Trust there.
Great, thank you. Here's a process. Have groups who've applied or groups that have been applying, have groups that have been applying are they able to find funding to support time to pull together the steering committee and the planning process? In your knowledge?
Yeah, to my knowledge, I think it depends on the local situation. I will say that we do provide that $7,000 and a small stipend to hire a project coordinator / consultant, but not until the feasibility study process starts. Really, before that, the work is done by a volunteer steering committee typically. That's kind of pulling together to walk through and start this process. So not to my knowledge, no. Okay.
And on average, how many groups apply each year? How many projects get site visits? And to clarify, this person is asking, would only one site get selected each year to become a trust?
So again, it varies every year tremendously. It really just varies so much. The site, I can say that when we go to the site visit phase, we typically are looking at, I'd say 2 to 4 communities to do site visits. And then just to confirm, yes, only one local community is selected to submit to submit a proposal and move into the feasibility study phase. And again, that's really just, again, we really want to make sure we're growing our network very meaningfully, and it is a lot to launch a Groundwork Trust. And so for us to support that process, for the National Park Service to support that process, and to make sure that we are committing to that, we do stick with one local community each year.
Okay, and here's a question. Once a trust has been selected, what is the expectation from that trust after the 3 to 4 year establishment period?
So we have a tight relationship with our Groundwork Trust. In terms of expectations, as you had mentioned, as that person had mentioned, for the first 3 to 4 years, there are milestones and thresholds that they need to meet. We do have sustainability thresholds, though, that we have developed as a network, and they kind of guide where each trust should be, and depending on where each trust is within those thresholds, Groundwork USA certainly offers support to get folks up to those thresholds. So after those 3 to 4 years, and that marker and milestones are really set because that's when capacity building funding is still being funneled to that local trust. There are very specific expectations of that trust, such as being part of network calls, some kind of obligations that we have as a network altogether that are laid out in an MOU prior to joining the network that are very clear. But most of it is really to the benefit of that local trust to be part of this local network of local actors doing similar work. I think I answered
Great. Yeah. Okay, so we still have a few more questions that are coming into the chat box, but there's one person who's had his hand up for a while, Solomon eBay. So I'm going to unmute your line, Solomon, and you can go ahead and just ask. Solomon, are you still there to ask? I will mute you again and just type into the chat box, and we'll try to get to your question.
Oh, he says he can't get his mic to open. I see his question.
Oh,
Thank you for
no.
your patience, Solomon.
Sure.
How many established trusts have failed? Have you had any instances of a trust dissolving and returning? That's a great question. I don't have a number off the top of my head for you. And I would say it's not so much that there's been a failure. It's more, there's a lot of different reasons why a trust may no longer be in existence. And some of that is, maybe there's not as much of a local need anymore. There may be just there may be another organization that has popped up, is doing some work, or maybe was already doing work and has moved into that same realm. There's just so many hosts of reasons. It is a very, very tiny number, though. And I can't think in my time if there's ever been, I'm not thinking of anyone, of a trust that maybe, as you say here, has dissolved and has returned. Unfortunately, no. But again, that number is quite small in terms of trusts closing their doors. Thanks for that question, Solomon, and thanks for your patience.
We have several more questions have come in. Somebody is wondering about the role of veterans inside the communities interested in applying for Groundwork funding. Does Groundwork try to include veterans in the planning or implementation process, and do we have any examples?
That's a great question. My first response is that absolutely they should be involved in the process, as any community member should be and that wants to be. What it also made me think of immediately is Groundwork Milwaukee, and unfortunately I can't speak too deep about this, but I would encourage you to go onto their website because it's a really cool program. It's called the Green Veterans. Again, that's Groundwork Milwaukee. And they have a program specifically geared towards veterans in their community, which sounds like you may be interested in. But that's my most obvious example to give you. But absolutely, they should be engaged as local stakeholders in the entire process.
Great. We have a question from somebody who comes from an area in Central California that is park poor, and they're interested in establishing a park or wilderness area or recreational space there. And there's been some work done to identify the area and meet with landowners. The question is, can Groundwork USA funds be used to establish a park?
Not in what we're talking about today. And so I kind of said it that way because no, this opportunity is not provided to help a community establish a park. It really is to build up an organization and for that organization to be in it for the long haul and to certainly do programs and projects, including things like developing parks. So while that may be something that a Groundwork Trust does in a local community, these funds are not really for the purposes of establishing a local park. And did you say Southern California for that one?
I believe Central California.
Okay.
We have another question. We've had a couple from folks who may have some type of organization already set up. They're wondering if an existing initiative or partner that has an existing steering committee and partners and is citizen-driven, can they use that existing infrastructure to satisfy the steering committee requirement?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would maybe want to talk more details, but I will generally say that I think you may have heard me mention earlier in the presentation that at the kind of formation of the steering committee at the very beginning before the LOI is submitted, we don't necessarily dictate what that has to look like, just that there needs to be a local steering committee that is reflective of the local community, both socioeconomically, racially, gender, and then has representation from various sectors of the community, business leaders, local government, residents, and the like. So it certainly doesn't sound like from what I'm hearing that would be an issue. It really needs to just be but needs to be a group of committed individuals representing the community to kind of see this process through. So as long as those folks are that and that they can commit to this in the long haul, certainly over that 6-month process for the feasibility study, but also everything that leads up to it, I don't see why that would be an issue.
Great. Well, I'm going to just continue here because we've got questions still pouring in. How is the trust fund? I'm glad that people are bringing a lot of questions
Absolutely.
here. How is the trust funded after the establishment period, and at what point are funds available for projects rather than operations?
So just so I make sure that I'm answering your question, I'm assuming that the establishment period is beyond 3 to 4 years of capacity building, because that's when I think, as you indicate here, as you say, that funding kind of stops in some ways, right? Like we provide the seed funding and some local capacity building funding. Beyond that, funding is primarily as a private as a loan-standing 501c3 entity, that is the responsibility of the individual trust to raise their funds. However, we often at Groundwork USA, part of our charge is really working with all of the Groundwork trusts to do collaborative or cohort-based projects and programming. And so some trusts will work with us directly on those projects and programs. In terms of funding directly for projects, that is not necessarily something that Groundwork USA provides to the trust. I do just want to emphasize that when a Groundwork trust does really and should be working towards in their capacity building years, building that funding base to be able to support themselves beyond those first few years.
Great. We have another, I'd say, process question in terms of timing. When in the process is an executive director selected? And is the idea that the steering committee becomes the nonprofit board and then recruits an ED? Or is it more likely, or is a likely ED hired during the $7,000 consulting phase?
Yeah, those are great questions. So it's typical that we see in terms of just I'll just kind of isolate these a little, that question of the steering committee becoming the board. That is a question that we often get from communities as they go through this process, and it really depends. We do sometimes see that the steering committee select folks don't really want to serve on a board of directors. It looks a bit different than serving on a steering committee. So it really depends on the interest of the steering committee members, their ability and capacity to commit to being on a board of directors. And then in terms of the hiring of the executive director, that typically happens during that launch phase, and the steering committee is certainly part of that process of seeking out an executive director. Really depends on, in parallel, how quickly that board is formed, because obviously that would be the group hiring the executive director, but there tends to be this kind of transition period where folks are kind of figuring out, can I commit to being on this board of directors? Do I want to? And then, again, really during that launch phase is when the executive director is hired.
Great. And I think a follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Got a couple follow-ups there. Actually, so is it expected that the local government partner serves as the steering committee convener, or would any local group be an appropriate drafter or applicant, drafter of the LOI or applicant?
Yeah, great question. So no, it's not expected that the local government partner serves as a steering committee convener. It doesn't have to be the local government. We do see that often. We sometimes see that it's an existing nonprofit. We sometimes see that it's a group of committed community members and someone serving as that point person. And then to answer your second part, which I believe the drafter of the LOI, a very similar answer in the sense that we have seen them come directly from municipalities, or we have seen them come from already existing nonprofits that would like to transform into a trust. And then there's also just a group or a collection of folks coming together to draft that with the idea that together they will raise the establishment of a trust and hire a local coordinator to assist with that, and then eventually down the line an executive director. I hope that answers
Great.
that question.
Thank you. And I think one final follow-up, because we're at the top of the hour, but
Sure.
Does the fact-finding scope of work theory of change happen before an ED starts?
I think I'm understanding this correctly. So At the stage at which the executive director would be hired, there is, right, because we've come, the local trusts would have, or community would have come so far in defining a bit about what their vision and future looks like for the trust. So some of that's established, right? However, it's obviously the executive director's role to lead that organization moving forward. And that's really a conversation between the board of directors, with support, obviously, from the National Office and Park Service and the executive director. So nothing is necessarily set in stone. That is the leader of the organization. However, there is obviously a lot of kind of visioning and drafting and thoughts. And really that launch strategy that's developed to kind of be the blueprint for the first 18 months is guiding what that executive director should be doing. So the board of directors or the steering committee, as they hire that executive director, should be looking for someone who can fulfill those visions and projects and programs and partnerships that the steering committee has set forth.
Great. And I have one final question. I know we're a little bit over, so
sure.
Somebody is wondering what kinds of lessons learned are available from both successful and unsuccessful attempts to apply for funding and launch a Groundwork Trust.
Ooh, I don't have anything I can share necessarily. I could be available for a follow-up call should that person want to speak. They can reach out. I think the best place I would just guide you to is the RFP, which is like really super detailed, and then encourage you to reach out to myself or also Heather Pasher. I don't think would mind if you reach out to both of us to kind of dig into that a little bit deeper. But generally, especially at this stage for the letters of interest, I would just highly suggest following what's in that request for proposal. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
And we can follow up offline on that question.
Yes, please feel free.
Great. So we're a couple minutes over. I want to thank everyone for your questions and time today. Hopefully we got to all your questions. If we didn't answer, or if you have additional questions that might arise, please don't hesitate to contact Stacy or Heather Pashier at the contact information on the screen. And do we have that confirmation? Let's put that up on the screen. There you go. And just as a reminder, okay, great. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to all participants along with a PDF of this presentation in the next couple of days. And we will also post it on our website at www.groundworkusa.org. So again, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you all so much.